With the Middle East on the brink of expanding war, anti-American sentiment increasing around the globe, terrorist organizations expanding their presence in many countries, and years of an open border policy, is this the perfect storm for another 9/11 attack? Hi, I'm Steve Monteiro, former Secret Service agent, military veteran, author, and 9/11 first responder. Join me as we discuss these issues and try to answer the question, are we on the brink of another 9/11 attack? Hi, I'm Steve Monteiro, and thank you for joining. I wish today's topic was on a subject a little bit more upbeat with the holidays coming up, but unfortunately, world events take their own course and we are where we are. I'm going to start today's show by referencing some comments made by FBI Director Christopher Wray to Congress on October 31st of this year. I'm going to read from some of his opening remarks. I'm not going to read the entire thing, and I'll be paraphrasing some of them. But I think these are important indicators and certainly caught my attention when I was reviewing his testimony. So this is Christopher Wray in front of Congress on October 31st of this year. The reality is that terrorism threats have been elevated throughout 2023, but the ongoing war in the Middle East has raised the threat of an attack against Americans in the United States to a whole other level. That's quite an impactful statement and a very worrisome one as well. Usually administrations try to tap this type of concern down because they don't want to worry the American people, and certainly sometimes it makes them look bad as well. But Director Wray just came right out and said it. He also went on to say that we assess that the actions of Hamas and its allies will serve as an inspiration, the likes of which we haven't seen since ISIS launched its so-called caliphate years ago. That's a very bold and impactful statement, and again, worrisome. In just the past few weeks, multiple foreign terrorist organizations have called for attacks against Americans and the West. Al-Qaeda issued its most specific call to attack the United States in the last 5 years. ISIS urged its followers to attack Jewish communities in the United States and Europe, which is taking place. Hezbollah has publicly expressed its support for Hamas and threatened to attack U.S. interests in the Middle East. And we've seen an increase in attacks on U.S. military bases overseas carried out by militia groups backed by Iran. The director went on to state that they cannot, meaning the administration, because he represents the administration in his comments obviously, the administration cannot discount the possibility that Hamas or another foreign terrorist organization may exploit the current conflict to conduct attacks here on our own soil. Quite amazing. The director went on to state that the Iranians, as the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism, which they are in fact, have directly or by hiring criminals mounted assassination attempts against dissidents and high-ranking and current former U.S. government officials, including right here on American soil. Obviously, there are many other comments that the director made. I'm not going to read them, but I'm going to finally close out his remarks, or my thoughts about his remarks, with this last statement, which indicated that over the last 2 years, the government has seized enough fentanyl to kill 270 million people. That's more than 80% of the American population. So just quite an impactful statement made by the director himself. And this was just recently, October 31st. Obviously, since the war on October 7th, the threats against the United States have increased exponentially, and we are dealing with that current environment. But what I failed to notice was the director didn't make any mention of the open borders, which is understandable because it makes the administration look bad, but clearly our open borders are a significant national security threat to us. We estimate there are probably anywhere from 11 to 16 million, perhaps more, illegal immigrants in the country. And I was reading an article the other day which indicated that over the last 2 years, there were approximately 900,000 gotaways that they were able to determine. Now, gotaways are basically people that illegally cross the border. They were seen through cameras and other methods, but unfortunately we didn't have the resources to intercept them and deal with them, so they basically got away. 900,000, so who knows who is in that group. So yeah, I was a little bit disheartened that he didn't mention the issue of the border, but certainly not surprised. The border is obviously huge gap in our security posture, and it needs to be addressed. We do have information that Hezbollah is operating out of Mexico and undoubtedly has operatives in the United States. The foreign concerns, the director mentioned in his statement that they're dealing with homegrown extremists and domestic extremists and violent extremists. And there are literally thousands of investigations that are currently open on those folks as well. And you couple that with the amount of attacks against our cyber attacks against our critical infrastructure, which I'll talk about in a second, and it just really paints a bleak picture for our current situation in the United States. Now, in the director's comments later on, he mentioned his concern about soft targets. And for those that are not aware of what soft targets are, basically they are locations and gatherings of people in which there is minimal or no security at all. And those could be grocery stores, malls, houses of worship, sporting events, concerts, and basically any place where people get together. And generally there isn't a high level of security. So those are called soft targets. And certainly in the United States, there's millions of them. So unfortunately, we are not able to do much with soft targets because, again, it's almost impossible to provide security for all of these smaller events and places where people can gather. Being an impossible task, it's also something that we as Americans probably would not want to have. If I am going to go to the mall and buy a shirt, for example, I don't want to go through a magnetometer to get to Macy's. It's not the type of country that we want to live in. And plus, if we acquiesce to the threats of the terrorists, then they win and we lose. So unfortunately, soft targets are just a reality of what we have to deal with. However, there are things that you can do as an individual. For example, if you're going into a building, take note of where the exits are, that you can get out of there quickly if you have to. Look for places for cover and concealment, places that you can hide or find better protection in the event that something takes place. And then, as a former colleague of mine in the Secret Service said, Dan Bongino, keep your head on the swivel and just be aware of your surroundings and look out for things that are suspicious, and certainly report those things to authorities. Because there have been instances, many instances in the country where these types of things were reported and attacks were thwarted. So that's what we can do as individual citizens when we're dealing with these soft targets. But what concerns me as well as the soft targets is the number of attacks that have occurred against our critical infrastructure. Now, for those that are not aware what critical infrastructure is, basically it's those services and operations that are absolutely necessary for the United States to function. And there are 16 segments that they divided our critical infrastructure into. I won't talk about all 16 of them, but I'll mention just a few. For example, in the energy sector, we have our oil refineries, we have our gas refineries, we have our food supply, we have our water supply, we have our electrical grid, we have our healthcare systems. So all of those are considered critical infrastructure and must be protected. Now, most people are not aware of the fact that 85% of our critical infrastructure is in the hands of private industry, not the government. So the various amounts of security and cyber protection just is so different among all of these different corporations and companies that own or run these critical pieces of our infrastructure. So it's essential that our government continue to work with them and provide them with the resources in order to protect themselves. Now, the amount of attacks, cyber attacks against these critical pieces of infrastructure has increased dramatically over the last few years. It's everything from ransomware, where they put a bug into your system and it doesn't work until you pay them a ransom, and then they'll send you a code that you can unbug it. Now, hospitals have been hit with this, and obviously they are a unique target because they would tend to pay, because obviously there are people's lives at stake if their computer systems are all fouled up. So that's going on. And we've had just about every piece of our critical infrastructure, all 16 segments, have been hit by cyber attacks, and they are increasing, and that is very troublesome. So it goes back to my point about our government needing to provide the funds and perhaps revisit all the funding that we provide to other countries and pay more attention to our critical infrastructure over here, which needs to be protected. The cyber attacks on our critical infrastructure, there's been physical attacks as well. We've had our power stations shot at and homemade bombs thrown over there in an attempt to blow up some of these power stations. We've had water treatment plants that were messed with. The cyber is also some physical attacks. So those are also points of vulnerability when we're talking about the possibility of an attack in the United States. Now, as I mentioned, clearly we had our own issues with 9/11, and we've made improvements since then, obviously, in the airline industry. But don't lose sight of the fact that our enemies understand where we've gotten better, but yet where we're still vulnerable. And unfortunately, Osama bin Laden and the 9/11 attacks set the bar very high for follow-on terrorists. I don't think they're going to be doing much with soft targets because they're not very impactful. You kill a few people, obviously that's a tragedy and horror for us and for the families and so forth, but it's not as impactful as our enemies want it to be. So the thought that something spectacular is being planned is a real possibility, and it's something that we need to pay attention to when we're talking about our current environment right now, which is absolutely critical. Now, my thoughts are that if the statement that was put into the record by FBI Director Christopher Wray doesn't make a case for closing the border, I'm not sure when the case will ever be made. Is it necessary that we have a catastrophic event occur in the United States before we wise up and we realize that we have a security vulnerability? So it's beyond me how we can still be arguing and dealing with that, with the crisis that we're facing now in the Middle East. And obviously our continued support for Israel is another point of contention that our enemies are going to look at. The more we support Israel, the higher the possibility of an attack here in the United States becomes. And that's just the reality that we're going to have to face. And of course, it's not just Israel fighting Hamas. We've got Hezbollah is involved in this, and they have attacked our bases throughout that region, and it's going on right now. So we are just a short fuse away from the entire region just exploding into a horrible regional war, which I certainly hope does not happen, but the possibility exists. So that leaves us with a lot of decision making, and it needs to be made quickly. And we're talking about those things that I mentioned in terms of securing the border, securing the critical infrastructure, and those are things that we can do. But I think we also need to take a step back and really try and understand our enemy, these terrorists. And I'm not talking about people in the Middle East that want peace or Palestinians that had nothing to do with the Hamas attack on Israel. I'm not talking about those folks. I'm talking about terrorists. Our understanding of them over the last few years, I think, has been flawed. And what I mean by that is we have adopted a posture of believing that these individuals are aggrieved people. And if we just deal with their grievance, all will be well in the world. Well, that is not the case. That is not the case at all. If you think about the billions that we've given the Iranians over the years, they're still calling for death to America, and they're attacking us through their proxies as I give this presentation. So this is ongoing. So it's not our presence, it's not our policy, it's a genuine hatred of our country and all that it stands for. It's an ideology on their part. the barbaric acts that they've committed against Israel just tell you they believe in this, and they feel justified in committing these atrocious acts, which is quite unbelievable. So we really have to try and understand that. And another example of that is our involvement in Afghanistan, which lasted for 20 years. And I was against us pulling out because basically we were turning the country over to the enemy that we fought for 20 years. We should have kept a small presence there, which would have provided us an ability to gather intelligence, which is important since the attack on 9/11 was basically planned and launched from Afghanistan. However, now we have no ears and eyes, and the ability for us to acquire intel information from that region is very, very diminished. But I'm bringing up the point is because we announced our departure from Afghanistan. We didn't leave in the middle of the night. It was announced. President Biden made that announcement that it was time for us to get out. So our enemies knew that we were going to leave. But our leaving alone wasn't enough for them. They gave us a going away present in the form of a suicide bomber who killed 200 Afghans and also killed 13 American heroes. So that was their going away present to us. So that just goes back to my point of it's not our presence, it's not our policies. They may contribute, but the bottom line is it is an ideological hate for the United States and what we stand for. So I think it's really important that we use that information to our advantage, because I don't think we can ever defeat an enemy unless we understand everything we can about them and how they operate. In the last few years of our trying to appease Iran through the nuclear deal, or releasing funds that we held for them because we wanted to make peace with Iran, just hasn't worked, and you can see that right now, and it will not work. I don't know how you negotiate with someone who says they want to kill you, they want to wipe you off the planet. Death to Americans has been chanted all around. So how do you sit down and negotiate with someone that has that kind of fervor and that kind of hatred for you? And if we don't understand where they're coming from, then it's going to be challenging for us to defeat them going forward. So, unfortunately, we find ourselves today in a very precarious situation involving the threat level to the United States and the possibility of an attack. So here we are 20 years later after the attacks on 9/11, and I'm going to answer the question that I posed at the very beginning. Are we in a position now that we can be attacked in a 9/11 type style of an event? And unfortunately, the answer is yes. And we need to recognize that, act appropriately, take the appropriate steps to secure our country from the border, protect our critical infrastructure. To protecting our critical infrastructure, it's also important that we become self-sufficient in energy and not rely on other countries, because obviously we can see how unstable the world is right now, and we need to make ourselves. We need to increase our defenses against an unstable world. We need to bring back the manufacturing of those essential things that we need in this country. For example, computer chips and health equipment that we need to manufacture here and not rely on another country, again, because of the current conditions in the world. Worrying about the Middle East, unfortunately, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, terrorism and terror organizations have expanded to numerous other countries around the world. So they're just not operating out of the Middle East or out of Afghanistan. They've expanded to Africa and other places. So that just makes things even more difficult, and more locations in which they can launch attacks against our American interests in their regions, or actually plan attacks against the United States. So we have our hands full, And our leaders really need to pay attention to this. Stop this infighting. Stop this bickering in Congress. Stop this party against party stuff. And do your job, which is first and foremost to provide for the safety and security of citizens of the United States. As the president, that's your number one goal. Congress, you're right there too. That is your goal as well. So I hope that we can get to that point, because I don't know how bad things have to get before we start really paying attention. And it just kind of reminds me of a quote that Winston Churchill once said, that America will eventually get things right after they've exhausted every other option. And I certainly hope that we will not exhaust every other option before we get it right. I'm Steve Monteiro. Thanks for listening. And if you like the show, please hit the like button and also the subscribe button. And also check out my YouTube channel page, and you'll find a link to my book, The Gray Bird of Baghdad. You don't want to miss out on that one. Again, Steve Monteiro, thank you for listening. Until next time.